capitalism before you came here today. So some of you have, many of you. Okay. And let's just hear a few things. What was it that prompted you to come? Why are you interested? I asked you this question, Paul. I'm curious what others have to say. Yeah.
I just feel like the environment today, we really need more of this type of business.
Okay.
It's good for everyone.
We need this.
We need this.
Okay, all right. And then in about very late 2014, beginnings of 2015, I met some people who were similarly interested, and we started the chapter of Conscious Capitalism here in Boston. So I'll tell you more about that at the end, but I'm one of the directors for Conscious Capitalism here in Boston. We put on events and we have membership. So there's ways, if you find this interesting and compelling, for you to get involved going forward and to learn more. So my plan for today is to focus on the 4 tenets of conscious capitalism to give you a sense for kind of the definition and what it's really all about. But we're really going to primarily focus on 2 of those tenets, higher purpose and stakeholder integration. And I've built this in such a way that I'm hoping that you can engage in some of this thinking for your business. And if it's not the business that you're leading, you can be thinking about, well, how might this apply to my business? So let's just start with getting grounded in capitalism. So capitalism is based on 3 things. It's based on wage labor, so paying people to do work. It's based on private ownership of means of production. And it's based on production for exchange and profit. Right? So 3 basic aspects to it. But it has also created all sorts of value in the world. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if you think about some things like gross domestic product per capita, how much people earn and how that has evolved over time, if you think about health and metrics associated with lifespan, it has increased people's lifespan dramatically. So about 250 years ago, the average lifespan for people was in the 30s. Okay, and now here in the States, I believe it's around 68. Okay, in Japan, it's 82. So, and one of the things that is a really important component of this is it's based on voluntary exchange. So no one's being compelled to do anything. When you want to make a trade, so to speak, you can. So, as capitalism has created all sorts of value, it has also developed a very poor reputation. So, if you look at Gallup polls and public confidence in large business, it has eroded significantly. And part of the issue is that there's just so many different ways that it can improve. And ways that it has, unfortunately, businesses have taken advantage of their employees. As an example, you can see here, in terms of pay ratios, right? So if you read the book, or if you look at the book, it talks about a ratio of 18 times being the max of the average salary in the firm versus the CEO salary, compared to 300 times in some businesses, and even more. So, in addition to employees, there's issues with people feeling like the community. What has business done to us? What has it done to society? And feeling like, in particular, large corporations have taken advantage of situations, and there are things like bailouts, and who's paying for that? Well, as you can see in the cartoon, Joe Q. Public, and not feeling very good about it. And they see problems with greed and fraud. So I mentioned a Gallup study. So 38% have very little or no confidence in big business. That's June of 2016. 63% are either somewhat dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with the size and influence of major corporations. 54% think large U.S. companies are doing either a poor or very poor job of creating jobs. Now, when you look at small business, the sentiment is different. It's much more positive, but it still has room for improvement. So another issue is that, I'm sure you all are, do you know what engagement is in an organization? It's about people caring about doing the work. And so there's all sorts of lost productivity and potential when you only have about 33% people engaged. So to use an example, if you think about rowing in a crew boat, right? So that means that 3 of the people in the boat are rowing hard. They're actively pulling on the oars. And 5 people, or 4 people in this case, are just kind of sitting there, pulling onto their oars, not really doing anything, right? And then one person is picking up the oar, and they're in the actively disengaged category, hitting people over the head with the paddle, right? Because they're in this actively disengaged, they don't like the work, they don't like the company, they actually despise it, and they're working against what they're trying to do. So, you know, again, there's what is, how have businesses treated the environment? You can think of Volkswagen. How have they dealt with investors and mistreated investors with fraud and misstatement of earnings, right? Think about how they've treated their customers, right? Wells Fargo, and how they, I'm sure you all have heard about the cross-selling scandal where they were selling their own customers additional accounts that they didn't even need. So this kind of just gives you a background that conscious capitalism sees the world of capitalism, and we see that it can be better. We believe that there's a better way. And it starts with consciousness. And so, what do I mean when I talk about consciousness? What do you think of when you think about consciousness?
Thinking.
Thinking, okay. Good, yeah, what else?
Just awareness.
Yeah, awareness. Oftentimes it's just awareness of the thinking, right, or of the feeling. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now is to do an exercise, because I want you to pay attention to that awareness. And that awareness can be directed in any number of different directions, towards your thoughts, towards your feelings, towards the environment, this room that we're in, right? Towards the other people in the room. So, conscious capitalism is about expanding that awareness. It's sort of this realization that we're all on a sort of a spectrum of being either not particularly aware, or on the other end, the enlightened, right, that are very aware, both of themselves as well as the people and the environment around them. So the key with conscious capitalism is about applying that awareness to business, to be intentional about the impact that you want to have. So what is conscious capitalism? It's an economic model, and in many respects we think of it as a movement, right? This movement, this change of business to create this new economic model that we believe is more sustainable, creates more value, more intentional value, more holistic value, and it's more impactful and better for all. So I'm going to show you a short video, just maybe 2 minutes of a longer video about conscious capitalism.
Capitalism. It's an economic system that has raised the living standards for billions of people worldwide.
Capitalism is a system of people creating value for other people and a continued upward progress.
We have gone from backbreaking poverty to the great wealth that we see around us.
Yet capitalism can have a dark side. Worker exploitation, income inequality, environmental abuse, an excessive focus on profits that can erode even the strongest societies. But an emerging movement could help change all that.
Conscious capitalism is a reimagining of the whole institution of capitalism.
It's a business-driven solution to some of the greatest weaknesses in a free market economy. 2 successful companies are making conscious efforts to engage their employees and to be environmentally responsible.
As we get help from our customers, from our community, from our government, we think that that vision can become a reality sooner rather than later.
Capitalism provides financial incentives for individuals and businesses to thrive. It has lifted billions of people out of poverty, raised living standards for entire countries, and increased life expectancies around the globe.
What is capitalism? What I mean when I say capitalism is a truly free market. Every economic decision is voluntarily entered into by the buyer and the seller. I don't have to buy your product, and I can go somewhere else if I don't like your product. I don't have to work for you if I don't want to, and you don't have to hire me if you don't want to hire me. All of that is the market economy, and that's a free market. It allows everybody to choose. A business is usually organized to make money.
It's what fuels growth and inspires businesses to innovate. From the beginning of time, people have been exchanging goods and services. Capitalism happens when people start to own property and mass-produce food and material on a larger scale. Other economic models emerge too, like communism and socialism, where government owns and distributes goods and services to the people. But for capitalism, success comes when businesses produce things that people want and can afford to buy. Yet it isn't perfect. Serious problems have emerged over time. Businesses can manipulate workers, consumers, and governments, and create unfair advantages in the marketplace. Vast inequalities can develop between the haves and have-nots.
There's deep frustration, and I think rightly so, that businesses are co-opting the coercive power the governments have for private hands. It's a form of cancer, I think, that can eat away at a society. Conscious capitalism is a holistic rethinking about the whole foundations of this capitalist model. And these problems and these challenges will best be met by businesses, not by governments, not by other entities.
Dr. Raj Sisodia is a professor of global business at Babson College. He has written several books and articles about conscious capitalism and is considered one of the thought leaders of the movement.
It's not anti-capitalism, it is capitalism, but it's done, conceived, and executed in a more conscious way. Most people don't understand business very well. Business is continually caricatured in these very narrow and flattering terms of being, it's all about the money, it's all about greed, it's selfish, it exploits people. When in fact, business is this great value creator in the world. Is it perfect? No. But overall, is it creating value? Yes. Could it create more value? It could, particularly if it adopted the principles of conscious capitalism.
Good. So that was just, again, a grounding in what conscious capitalism is all about. So what we're going to do now is spend a few moments thinking about sharing the model with you and diving into some details on the higher purpose and the stakeholder orientation. So in terms of conscious leadership, that's about applying that notion of awareness to you as a leader and the choices that you're making and the impact that you're having on the people around you. So this happens to be a picture of Yvon Chouinard from Patagonia, the apparel company, originally a climbing hardware company based out of California. And I really love this quote. He says, "I'm convinced that most of the damage to the environment is caused unintentionally by true ignorance," right? Ignorance is that example of lack of awareness. And so once we decided that we were polluters and that we were causing a lot of damage by not leading an examined life, we decided to change that. So this is an example of a person running a company that decided, you know what, we're polluting. And we need to pay attention to that, and we need to think about how we're doing the business in such a way that we can minimize the impact. And ultimately, he says that's the reason why my company exists, is to be an example for other companies and to show how that's good business. So when we think about conscious leadership, it's about that awareness, but it's also about where do they place themselves in the hierarchy, so to speak. Have any of you heard of servant leadership before? Right? So it's built around the idea of servant leadership. Conscious leaders tend to be servant leaders. And the idea there is that they are there to help and to serve people, not to rule them. And in doing so, they bring people up and forward and grow and develop them. It's empowering. People have more choice, and they tend to create great loyalty with these kinds of leaders. So that's conscious leadership. So this is a picture of a company that's based out of New York that actually has an office in Kendall Square in Cambridge called NextJump. It's a software company. They make perks software. So for a large organization, they can use NextJump software to connect their employees to organizations where they might want to buy something, whether that's a bank or Walmart or whatever it might be. It's called Perks at Work. But they don't profess to really be about the nature of their business. They're about their culture. And it's pretty profound what they've done to be intentional about their culture. Many organizations, their culture is accidental. It just happens. It just is. But at NextJump, they actively work to develop their culture. So like some organizations, they've created a set of values and they operate by those values. But they also review people according to those values. They have certain practices around feedback that's created all sorts of transparency in the culture so that people have a greater sense of trust in the decisions that are getting made in the organization and how they're being made. They're use these values and this organizational clarity in hiring and firing. They use it in behavior reviews, and they use it in employee development. They actually have a no firing policy. But the no firing policy only happens because they spend 3 weeks, people come into a boot camp, what they call an orientation boot camp for 3 weeks, where before they're fully put onto a team where they're kind of integrated into the culture, and they either make it or they don't make it according to how they fit into the culture. So that's conscious leadership and conscious culture, two of the tenets, two of the 4 tenets. So now we're going to dive into higher purpose and go a little bit deeper on this. So if we were to think about the human body, we can make a comparison. And so for the body to live, we need red blood cells, right? And if we don't have red blood cells, what happens? You die, right? It doesn't go well, right? But is that our purpose for being? Is our purpose for being to create red blood cells? Is that why you get out of bed in the morning? No, right? Of course not. So, and the same is true of business and profits. Profits are very important for a business in order to sustain itself, in order to invest in research and development and in new products and services. Profits are very important. But that's not why a business exists. They need to reach and stretch a little bit more deeply to understand what is that business for. If you think about a doctor, right? So doctors are some of the most well-paid people in society. Is that why they exist? Doctors exist to make money? No, right? They exist to help people to be healthy, to heal them, right? And you could think about architects. Why do they exist? Right? It's around design and creating spaces where people can connect and do good work and socialize. So the same is true for all sorts of businesses. Some businesses are harder than others to understand what that higher purpose is And even if your business doesn't have a direct connection to a higher purpose, it's fascinating to me how many organizations have found ways to connect to a higher purpose. But ultimately, the higher purpose is really an organization's answer to the question, why do we exist? So it's once that is clarified, it is very useful. When you know that, it's useful in attracting people who are similarly, that purpose resonates with them. It's useful in making sure that people are, I talked about engagement before, it taps into their intrinsic motivation. Any of you ever heard of the book Drive before? Right, so there's a book called Drive, and it refers to the 3 things that create motivation in people, and one of them is intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose are what drive that motivation, but so much of it comes from inside, right? And so when you connect to someone's purpose and why they want to work, they give you what's called discretionary effort. They give you more. Right? And it's also helpful when you know purpose in guiding your decisions strategically and culturally. This is a quote that I love from George Bernard Shaw. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. Right? So the idea is we all have this desire to make a difference, and when organizations are able to tap into that, they're able to bring people to a higher place. In the book, they give 4 different categories of kinds of higher purpose. So organizations that focus on service, you can think of organizations like Nordstrom, JetBlue, the Container Store, Trader Joe's. They find in their higher purpose this notion of serving other people and find great meaning in that. You may have all had experiences, whether that's at a department store or at a hotel somewhere, where you could tell someone took great pride in the way that they were serving you. There are organizations that are focused on advancing human knowledge. Organizations that are focused on excellence and beauty, as well as a purpose around courage to change and make improvements in our society and in our world. So here's just some examples. You can see at the top, there are examples from larger organizations. These are organizations that were featured either in Conscious Capitalism or featured in a book called Firms of Endearment, which was also written by Raj Sisodia. And you can see this sort of this notion of higher purpose built into them. But then I found 4 smaller businesses, some of which are local. So Next Jump, which I was referring to a moment ago, better me and better you equals a better us. So the idea behind that is they're been defined as a deliberately developmental organization. They're very intentional about growing the people there. And so the idea is, as we each develop ourselves as individuals, we now grow the ability of ourselves to help the people around us grow. It's kind of like when you're on the airplane and they say, well, in the event of an emergency, make sure you put the mask on your own face first. Take care of yourself, and then you'll be able to help other people, right? So better me plus better you creates a better us, a better world. Very idealistic. I just ran across this company, Asana, yesterday through Conscious Company Media to help humanity thrive by enabling all teams to work together effortlessly. So they create a collaboration software. But to me, this notion of to help humanity thrive, very idealistic, certainly connected to a higher purpose. There's a business based out of Wakefield, Massachusetts called Sentinel Benefits and Financial Group. Right? So this company, Permaseal, is a company I came across. They're based in the Midwest in Chicago. They do basement waterproofing. And you might say to yourself, well, what's the higher purpose in that? And yet I heard their CEO speak, and they have decided that their purpose is the very broad, non-specific, to make the world a better place. But you can tell that it's true by the way that she speaks about the company and by the way that they run the company. They have made all sorts of decisions that are evidence of the fact that they operate this way and truly believe that that's their higher purpose. So, now is your chance to think about higher purpose for you. This is an exercise to help you find your higher purpose. And this is called a 5 whys exercise. Question at the top of the page.
What is your business?
Yeah, what does your business do? So pretty straightforward. Paul can tell you that. What I'm going to ask you to do is take notes for him, right, as you're going through this interview, and then you can just give him the sheet at the end so that he'll have those notes. So he'll say what his business does, and then you're going to say, why does it do that? Or why do you do that? And he'll have an answer for that. And your job is just to listen, to really focus on him, pay attention, try and get a sense for what he means, what's behind what he's saying to the extent that you can. No need for you to interject or suggest things so much. Try and let him do the work, right, or her. And whatever he or she says, go ahead and write it down, and then ask again, why does your business do that? So the idea is it ought to be diving deeper and deeper until you find something higher. Something that is connected to an idealistic sense of greater good. So,
That was fun.
looks like you guys had, my impression was you had some good stimulating conversation. Good, excellent, all right, terrific. So just be curious to hear some of the outcomes. Did anybody feel like they got a little bit more centered on their higher purpose? Yes? No? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm seeing some heads nodding. Anybody feeling inspired to share what they came up with, knowing that it was just this 5-minute exercise and it may change over time?
People think of capitalism as being a me-centric sort of operation, and yes, it is. I mean, you have to look at it as, in order to survive, you have to take care of me because
It's like that
nobody else
oxygen
can do
mask.
it. But then you have to realize that me is not just me. It's people around me. It's my community. It's my family. It's my species. Me is not just me. It's a broader perspective.
Nice.
And you have to be aware of that.
Well, good. It's not always easy to stay connected to the purpose, right? Particularly when you're in time of struggle, right? You get stretched, right? You're pulled by different forces. And the more clear you are about that purpose, the easier it is to make decisions. But when you're in times of survival, when you're in times of rapid growth, or in great transition, it can be harder to stay connected to the purpose. And that's why it's the more that you can surround yourselves with people who are similarly minded, it helps you stay focused together despite the challenge, right? And to move past that notion of just surviving into really thriving. So the next tenet we're going to focus on, and this has this similar kind of messiness, is stakeholder integration. The idea behind stakeholder integration is the notion that every business has a set of stakeholders, people that care about the business or are impacted by the business in some way or another. So basic examples and common examples for many businesses are employees, customers, vendors, investors, the environment, the community. Other kind of more peripheral stakeholders could be the government, could be media, could be unions, could be any number of other, even competitors could be stakeholders. So the thing is, we've been talking about how businesses create value. I referenced GDP and I referenced people's health. And businesses can create value in many different ways. It can create financial value. So what are some examples of financial value that business creates?
Dividends? Money.
Sure, stocks and dividends, wages, right? So it creates value for the people that work there through the wages that they give. At our local chapter here of Conscious Capitalism, we recently heard a talk by John Pepper from Boloco, you know, the burrito chain. He's made a very intentional choice that to pay $15 an hour for minimum wage, which is unusual for a business like that. It would typically go with the minimum wage. He's trying to make it what's called a living wage and build a business around that. Okay, there's social value. What are examples of the social value that a business creates?
It's the culture, if it's like an environmental company or the...
Sure, well, I mean, the culture in many respects is a social value, and then you think about the relationships that people develop, just think of within the company. The friendships people develop with the people that you know. I've heard many people that I've worked with have said, I spend more time with my coworkers than I do with my family. Right? So it becomes like a family. Hopefully it's like a productive, functional family. So, but again, that's the value that it can create. If you look at some of the Gallup research and some of the research they've done around engagement at work, one of the things that they refer to is they have a set of 12 questions that define people's experience at work. And one of those questions is, do you have a best friend at work? And for those people that do, they tend to be more attached and staying with the company. They're retained longer. Of course, there's intellectual value when you think about the R&D that organizations support and the development of products and services. But there's also, you think about the intellectual value that's created through the development that they do. I talked about NextJump before, a deliberately developmental organization. They're intentionally trying to grow their people. There's emotional value. So one of the greatest, I believe, again, according to Gallup, one of the biggest single indicator of people's happiness is their job, right? And so the amount that they enjoy their work and the people around them has such a great impact on their emotional well-being. Think about the expressions of people that you see that don't have work and are downtrodden. And you can see how it has an impact the other way when people do have work that they enjoy, that's meaningful. Not only does it help them to take care of their family, but in those organizations where they feel they have a sense of higher purpose, they're making a difference in the world. Right? There can be spiritual value, and by spiritual value, I don't mean necessarily something related to God or religion, but I mean about that connection to higher purpose, which we just explored. Cultural value. Here in Boston, we know about the organizations that support our cultural institutions, whether that's the BSO or the Boston Philharmonic or many, many other organizations that are supported through business and philanthropy. All right, there can be physical well-being and value that's created. I'm sure many of you are familiar with wellness programs that organizations support and how that creates value for people. If people are working at desks all day, it can serve to detract from their physical well-being, and that's why the work that you're doing creates such value when organizations bring folks like yourselves in to help them stay healthy, right? Again, I hate to be a one-trick pony and sharing this example of NextJump. It's fascinating how they offer gym classes and they support people's physical health and well-being in addition to their development as people at work. And then, of course, it can create environmental value through the management of the energy, as well as the resources that they're consuming, managing through their waste and pollution, but also you think about the volunteering that organizations support. And they have their employees have paid days off to go volunteer. And that can be to create value in any number of directions for communities, but in some cases it's to go, clean up a public space. All right, so we're going to have a little contest here to explore stakeholder integration. So you need to find a partner. This is a game that works well with just two people. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, why don't you stand up and face your partner? It could be somebody that you just worked with, or if you want, you can mix it up and work with somebody new or different. All right? And so go ahead, stand up. And what we're doing, this contest, is to see who can get the most points. And the way you earn points is through thumb wrestling. So if you know thumb wrestling, right? So you just have to grip like this, right? And then if I hold Paul's thumb down, I get a point, right? If he holds my thumb down, he gets a point, right? So you're going to have 30 seconds to get as many points as possible. All right, let's see how many you can get.
Let's do the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, you don't have to do the 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a thumb war. You can just start. So let me get my timer ready. 30 seconds. Everybody have a partner? Ready, set, and go. Raise your hand if you had between 5 and 10. Okay. 10 and 20. Okay. Over 20. All right, how many did you have?
37.
Holy mackerel. And how many did you have?
45, but we were being really nice about it. We were sharing the wrestling.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Yes, we were competitive.
We were collaborating.
They were collaborating. Did anybody else collaborate? I saw some other collaborators out there. Were you guys collaborating? It looked like you were collaborating.
That's illegal. That's collusion.
All right, so that's collusion, right? So here's the thing about stakeholder integration. We oftentimes think about, right, ourselves or one other party, right? So the comment, those of you who had less than 5 were just competing, right? Yeah, and so you were doing the whole little dance and trying to avoid getting pinned and all of that, and which is normal and fine. And that's sort of culturally the way our society is built here around competition. We kind of grow up that way to naturally compete. And that's fine. But remember, I did give you a goal, which was to earn as many points as possible. Right? So in this case, you can earn points, as these folks found out, while your partner earns points. Right? There's nothing in the points that they earn that really detracts from the points that you're earning. And that is the challenge in this stakeholder integration, is trying to create value for your organization while at the same time creating value for your customers, for your employees, for your investors, because yes, they do want a profit, for your vendors, for the community, for the environment. Right, so that's the notion behind stakeholder integration, is to create value. And it may come in different forms, and the different forms that I was describing, but how are you creating that value intentionally for all of those stakeholders? So it's kind of evolving the notion of competition from a zero-sum game. It's growing beyond the notion of the fixed pie and seeing that actually there's more and that it can grow if we're creative and innovative and persistent. Right? It builds beyond the notion of we always have to make trade-offs. Right? It's about thinking long-term, and it's about thinking in alignment with others and thinking holistically. In many respects, you can think of it as if it was one, if you think about that whole set of stakeholders as if that was one organization, as opposed to a set of organizations. Right? So, and yet, it's not easy because we're constantly compelled by the needs of these different stakeholders and how they can be in conflict with one another. And you have to be very determined and persistent in order to get beyond the natural trade-offs that you see, right? So an example of a trade-off could be that you buy materials for a product at a cheaper price, right? So you think, well, maybe that creates value for the investor because now we can buy at a lower price and presumably sell at the same price and have a higher profit. And yet your trade-off is that now perhaps you're creating an inferior product, lower quality, based on the quality of the materials, right? So that's just a simple, basic example. So let's think about creating value for customers. Well, and it sounds like it, for those of you who have a device, an Apple device, that it's very helpful. It makes it easier to use their devices. And you think about the result that they get in creating this value for the customers. Think about the lines that show up when they release new products, right? So they create products that people really enjoy, they use, they work, and they're unique, and so they've created raving fans, right? So that's an example of how an organization creates value for their customers. So we're going to do another exercise, and we're kind of going to do this as we go. So there's one for you and one for your partner. Because what I want you to be thinking about is your business and how are you creating value for your various stakeholders. So the first question is, how can your business create more value for your customers? Right? So many of you may very intentionally create value for your customers, but I want you to give a moment just to think about how could you create even more. When we think about the notion of conscious capitalism, I was talking about awareness before and how that awareness is along a spectrum, and I think the same is true of businesses. There are businesses that have grown their awareness and are intentional about it and have moved further and further along, and they are examples of businesses that you might call conscious capitalism. And then there are some that truly aren't, that are not operating that way. And Apple's been cited for their practices with their vendors overseas and how there's, the worker conditions are not great. So to me, that's an example where they've got progress to make. And the same can be true of the environmental impact of some of the products and how that's impacting the environment. I'll jump ahead a little bit. It doesn't really answer your question, but the point is it's along a spectrum and it's about making progress over a period of time. Walmart, what do you think of Walmart in terms of their impact?
Unrelieved evil.
Yeah, right? So they've developed this incredible reputation for many people around, what did you say?
Unrelieved evil.
Unrelieved evil, right? So you guys have some strong opinion around Walmart. And yet, there are people who shop there who I think are grateful for the experience in terms of being able to afford things and buy products at a low price that works for them. But there's also some statistics that I'll share a little bit later in terms of the work that they've done environmentally to be sustainable that's pretty striking. And so it's not for me to decide whether they are a conscious capitalist or not, but they are intentionally doing some work on that piece of their stakeholder to create more value there. And so I think that's part of the challenge, is organizations may put more emphasis on one stakeholder versus another, but the holy grail is really trying to create value for all of them. So just take a moment, and you can work in your pairs to ask these questions or to work together if you want, but just take a moment to think about your customers. How are you creating value for them? How can you create more value for them? I'm just going to give you a couple minutes for you each to work individually on that, and if you want to check in with a partner, you're welcome to do that as well.
It's so fascinating. But I don't have.
No,
So if I can just pull your attention back up front. And I realize this is quick. Hopefully you can take the opportunity to work on this a little bit more after this session. Okay, good. So your piece kind of leads to the next stakeholder when I think of employees. In your case, it's volunteers, right? But organizations create value for their employees. Has anybody here heard of a company called Barry Waymiller before? So it's a company based out of the Midwest. It's a manufacturing company. They make equipment. Large, heavy-duty industrial equipment that's used in bottling lines and things like that. So, and yet this tagline, building great people is our business. That's Bob Chapman, their CEO. I encourage you to check out, he's got a TED Talk that I think you'd find very interesting. He has when I talked about sort of this continuum or spectrum and how you create value for your stakeholders, he's someone who has talked about how he has transformed. In some ways, he's created an increased consciousness as a leader. He's a conscious leader, and part of what he's become more conscious of is the impact that his organization has on its people. So what he noticed was that a lot of people seemed really unhappy. People working in blue-collar manufacturing jobs seemed very unhappy. And there's a statistic that on Mondays, the likelihood of someone having a heart attack increases. The highest day is, I think, it's like Sunday, Monday, as they're anticipating going to work on Monday. Right? So he was noticing some of these kinds of things happening in his people, and he didn't like it. He came from an accounting background, and he was very focused on the bottom line. And he transformed over time to build an organization that is all about caring and developing their people. And it's really pretty amazing. He's written a book called Everybody Matters. So the extraordinary power of caring for your people like family. Right? So this is one way that they've created value for their employees. So it's not just financial value, but they've really focused on that emotional and social value. So I'm not going to ask you to work on this one, right? But that's something that you can pay attention to, right? And then there's investors. So what is it that organizations are doing to create value for their investors? Warren Buffett, to me, is a great inspiration around that, not only in terms of the year after year after year of returns that he's generated, but it's also about what is their attitude towards the companies that they're investing in. So I'm kind of taking a sideways look at this, but the common conventional wisdom amongst many investors is this 90-day short-term cycle and what's the next quarterly profits going to be. And yet, that creates a very short-term focus on businesses, which impacts and diminishes their ability to have this kind of broad, long-term view. But he takes a very long-term view. It's not speculative. Right? He buys organizations that he believes create value, has good management, and he trusts that management to do what they do. And it's important as you may be in a business and you may be looking for investors, it's important to consider what is the philosophy of the investors. Will they stand by you in a crisis? The co-author of the book Conscious Capitalism, John Mackey, who you saw in the video, has a very powerful story about when Whole Foods was in crisis and how some of his investors stood by him and the difference that it made for them in their business. Next up, we're going to shift to vendors, right? So how are organizations creating value for their vendors? This reminds me of the question that you had when I think about Timberland. right? So the apparel company, I'm sure you're familiar with the boots, Timberland boots. And what's amazing about Timberland is how they focused on worker conditions around the world and how they have built and made intentional efforts to build with vendors environments that are healthy for their workers overseas. Things like building green space around the factories so that people have a place to go to sort of get a little bit of nature, so to speak, when they're not in the factory. To think about the environmental impact throughout that supply chain, and to notice sort of the cradle to grave impact of the beginning of the product and where it came from to when it's being disposed, of managing that in a way that creates the least amount of waste. Vendors tend to be the stakeholder that is most easily kind of taken advantage of or ignored or neglected in this stakeholder ecosystem.
They can be influenced by a responsible buyer, a responsible company that's buying their products.
Right, and it's one of the things that can be so powerful in building this. When you show respect for those vendors and when you treat them fairly and well. So this is a place where, you know, Walmart does not tend to get high grades, is in how they've treated their vendors, because they tend to pit them against each other, as opposed to choosing a vendor, sticking with them, and having a long-term orientation to that relationship. And then when you are in a hard time, that vendor sticks with you. And maybe they give you better terms in terms of credit or whatever it might be. Good. And then community. I'm sure any of you could think of numerous examples of how organizations have gotten involved in their community and tried to give back. This is just a picture of some people. Again, that company, Sentinel Benefits and Financial Group, they have a program called Sentinel Cares. They're very active and engaged in a variety of different, from schools, they go in and teach financial literacy because they happen to be in the financial business like yourself, right? But they also go and they help with Habitat Humanity, they help giving food to those who need it, right? So it's a real mix of things, and creates all sorts of value, and it's built their reputation within the community. All right, so Walmart, this is your favorite company, right? So here's what they've done. They've eliminated 28 million metric tons of greenhouse gases from its global supply chain. So that may not be perfect, but geez, it's a step in the right direction. That's positive to me, right? Their goals in terms of their sustainability goals is to be supplied 100% by renewable energy. You talked about the solar. Okay, achieving zero waste across our global operations, and to sell products that sustain our resources and environment. So each of these is an opportunity for you to think about environment, community, vendors, whichever it might be, and you can see the questions on that handout that I gave you, ways that you can be thinking about how do we create value for these different stakeholders. And the challenge is, how do you do it all at the same time? But when they do, and when those organizations are able to create value in that way, they actually create value for themselves. They get great returns. So this comes from the book I referenced, Firms of Endearment, and the research done by Raj Sisodia. And it just shares the average annualized return compared to the S&P 500 from 2002 to 2012. And you can see that 13% versus 4%. There's another study where it compares, some of you may be familiar with the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, and how that was a book that was studying the performance of higher performing companies, and what was it, kind of breaks it down, and what is it that created that performance. And these businesses all way outperform the good to great companies. So the conscious capitalism can be confused as sort of this altruistic, just do good kind of way of doing business, when in fact it's actually just a very good way to do business. It helps you to compete, because when you have relationships with vendors, customers, etc., your community believes in you, people want to buy your products. They remain loyal. They remain loyal as employees. Right? So there's real opportunity in pursuing business this way in terms of the performance. So here are some examples, and I sought to find some examples that are local, that might be recognizable to you, many of which I've talked about already. Curriculum Associates is based in Billerica. They actually are one of the main sponsors for Conscious Capitalism. Fidelity Bank is out in Worcester. Teak Media is right here in Boston. And in terms of the movement, just so you have a sense, it is a growing movement. There are about 24 chapters, local chapters around the country, and 10 international chapters, and those numbers are kind of increasing on an annual basis as chapters self-form. And they all have conferences and events and have membership. And so, for example, here in Boston, our next event is November 30th. It's at Impact Hub in Boston. I'd certainly encourage you, if this was compelling to you or you're interested to learn more, I encourage you to come to an event. You can certainly think about becoming a member, and if you become a member, you can always think about volunteering for the chapter. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention and engagement in the presentation.